Could we ask everyone to please be seated? We have certainly had a very rich day of presentations and conversations, and I have to tell you that I'm really happy to be able to introduce our next speaker. She's one of our own. She's from the University of Maryland, and I know of her because of the amazing written works that she has contributed to the field. Dr. Carol Graham is the Leo Paswalski Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, College Park professor at the University of Maryland, and a senior scientist at Gallup. She has been a vice president at Brookings and a special advisor to the president of the International American Development Bank. She is author of numerous books, most recently, The Pursuit of Happiness, An Economy of Well-Being, which is I very much recommend that book, and Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires, and has published articles in a range of journals including Science, the World Bank Research Observer, Health Affairs, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Health Economics, and the Journal of Social Economics. Her work has been reviewed in Science, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, among others, and she has received the Pioneer Award from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 2017, and a Lifetime Distinguished Scholar Award, the International Society of Quality of Life Studies, in 2018. She has an AB from Princeton, a Master's of Arts from Johns Hopkins, and a PhD from Oxford University. And she has 3 beautiful children. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Carol Graham.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I've met a couple of old friends already, which is very nice. And I should also recognize Sergio Pinto, who's sitting right there, my brilliant PhD student, who is a partner in crime on a lot of the research I'm going to talk about. So I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I was invited to a conference on infrastructure and happiness. I was thinking streets and roads and, what did I know about that? But having delved into it a bit more, I realized that a big part of that is sort of infrastructure and human capital. And that very much coincides with what I've been up to. Like that? Okay, all right. So I've worked, spent most of my life, even before working on well-being, going around very poor parts of the world. I'm from Peru originally. I've done a lot of work on public health, poverty, and equality in very poor countries, among very poor people all around the world. I've probably been to more weird slums in the world than anybody in the room. But over the past 10 years, I've been coming back to the U.S. going, what is it about poverty in the U.S. that's so depressing? And it comes down to basically the high costs of being poor in a very rich country. But also, why doesn't anybody in this country care about inequality when our inequality has increased so much that it is, and it's not just inequality of income, we are no longer the land of opportunity. Our mobility rates are at the bottom of the OECD. As Carrie could probably tell you, we're really not exceptional in terms of mobility, so inequality isn't a signal that everybody who works hard can get ahead. And yet nobody seemed to care. And so I thought, maybe if I told the story from the perspective of the inequality and poverty story, from the perspective of well-being metrics, maybe people would care more. Maybe, knowing that happiness or hope or stress and anger are very unequally shared, maybe people would resonate more with that than the kind of metrics we use in our analysis to measure inequality, like the Gini coefficient or the Thiel coefficient or the 90-10 ratio, and the average person on the street could care less. So I set out to tell this story, and my starting point was essentially the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and which basically has the pursuit of happiness in quite centrally featured in it. And so the first thing I did was to kind of explore what Jefferson was thinking about when he wrote this. I'm certainly not a philosopher, nor a historian, but it was kind of fun to delve into this. And it really is not about guaranteed outcomes. It's not about contentment. It's about happiness in the fullest sense, in the way Carol Riff works on, and sort of meaning and purpose in life. And so he really thought of happiness as the opportunity to seek a fulfilling life. And he was grounded in the writings of Aristotle and Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, which Carol Riff will talk more about tomorrow. But also his thinking resonated with that of John Stuart Mill, although John Stuart Mill hadn't published yet. Maybe they talked to each other in cyberspace or something, I don't know. But Mill's concept of liberalism, which combines individual freedom and social fairness. So this is it was a much deeper concept of happiness. It's not about the happy peasants in my other book. It really is about the opportunity to lead fulfilling lives. And so I asked, the U.S. is more unequal by any number of measures. Is the American dream and the right to the pursuit of happiness equally available to all citizens today? Spoiler alert, the answer to that question is definitively not. And so let's maybe try and tell the story. We've had some stark markers. One is just how much our income inequality has increased. But another was the 2016 elections, where most of us woke up to a divided country we didn't know was such a mess and so depressing in terms of the kinds of divisions. An equally stark marker is the fact that the U.S. is the only rich country in the world where mortality rates are going up rather than down, and that's driven by preventable deaths among less than college-educated whites in their middle-age years, the so-called deaths of despair. So what I'm going to talk about is based on the first part of the sort of inequality and well-being story is in my most recent book called Happiness for All, Unequal Hopes and Lives in Pursuit of the American Dream, and then some newer research where we have been using well-being metrics to try and understand the deaths of despair, and that's joint with Sergio, and I will get to that. And then finally, if I have time, so we should end at 5 o'clock. Okay, so hopefully at the end I can talk a little bit about some new research I'm doing on trying to understand hope and resilience and to see whether it can be restored in populations where it's been lost. And that's a big open question, and I may be chasing down a rabbit hole on that one, but hopefully not, and I'd love some comments on that. Let me talk a little bit about the metrics and well-being measurement, happiness measurement, because I think it's quite important so that our findings make some sense, and for people who aren't immersed in well-being measurement, hopefully useful. So it's gone from a nascent collaboration between economists and psychologists to an entire new approach in the social sciences. So I was one of the original early economists working on this. I fell into it by mistake, doing interviews of poor people in Peru and looking at their income mobility, trying to understand inequality and its effects, and found incredible movements out of poverty at a time where there was a lot of debate about how bad globalization was for the poor in poor countries. And I was looking at this data going, but these people are making incredible strides out of poverty. I had data over the same people for a 10-year period. So I thought, I wonder how they think they've done. And I went back and asked the same respondents how their economic situation today was compared to the past. And over half of the people who'd done the best said it was terrible or worse. And then a lot of poor rural people who'd had no income change said their situation was the same or better. So first I thought, maybe this is just the day the survey was taken. Maybe Chile beat Peru in soccer that day, who knows? But I repeated the survey. We got the same exact findings. I got data for Russia, where you had even more frustrated, upperly mobile people, and then even data for China, and I've seen this pattern over and over again. Sergio and I have actually recently been finding it in the intergenerational mobility for the United States. So I called them my happy peasants and frustrated achievers. And in trying to understand this finding, I was lucky enough to be at Brookings at the time with a lot of wonderful, very open-minded economists that didn't think it was crazy. George Akerlof was one of them who pointed me not to the economics literature, but to the sociological literature to try and understand this on aspirations and habituation and other things. And Danny Kahneman, right before getting his Nobel Prize, the first psychologist to get the Nobel Prize in economics, was involved in this and was actually thrilled to be invited to come to Brookings to talk about my first book that got absolutely no publicity, but at least Danny liked it. At the time, we really were considered crazy. And the head of economic studies at Brookings at the time said, Carol, this is a great manuscript. It was called Happiness and Hardship, and it was about mobility and opportunity in the third world. He said, you've got to take happiness out of the title because nobody's going to take you seriously. Kept it in the title, didn't sell many books. I'm not sure if there's a correlation there, but 9 years later, Happiness Around the World went viral. And I don't think it was that much of a better book. It was that over time, the approach had just gotten much more traction in terms of academic rigor, in terms of crossing disciplines, but including in skeptical old mainstream economics. And then efforts beyond academia, such as the OECD, Better Life Index, the British government putting well-being metrics into their statistics. We even had a National Academy of Sciences panel on what metrics, well-being metrics, we might put into our own statistics. So there was much more receptivity to it. That and the financial crisis, which I think forced people to recalibrate measures of progress and kind of the endless chase for money. In any event, it's become much more accepted, still not among all economists at least, but it has become a pretty exciting field to work in, and I think it's helping us understand some important policy questions. So we can answer questions as diverse as the effects of commuting time on well-being, why cigarette taxes make smokers happier, and why the unemployed are less unhappy with local unemployment rates. So if you thought of any of those things from an economics framework, it doesn't make sense, right? Neoclassical economics would say you buy the big house far away because you want the big house, you're optimizing your preferences, and that should make you happy. If you smoke, you're smoking because you're making an optimal, rational choice within a fixed budget constraint, and so therefore that should increase your utility, which we all know is nuts because most smokers are addicted to nicotine. And then finally, unemployment finding seems quite weird. If you're in an economics framework, if you're unemployed, and there are more unemployed people in your neighborhood or your state, your predicted probability of being reemployed in the future is much lower. So that should be negative for your utility in the classic economic sense. But most average Joes and Janes don't sit around and predict their probability of being reemployed in the future. They feel stigma if they're unemployed. If there are more unemployed people around them, they don't think it's a personal thing. There are lots of reasons. Maybe there are more people to play backgammon with. But there are lots of reasons why the standard economics framework, and it doesn't always work in understanding the well-being of unemployed people or smokers or whatever it might be. So the kind of well-being measurement approach is particularly well suited for understanding situations where individuals don't have the agency to make choices, such as, and or when consumption decisions are not the result of optimal choices. So I think about macro and institutional arrangements individuals can't change. Inequality is one, but so are things like discrimination and caste systems or whatever. People will behave very differently under those circumstances because they don't have the agency to make a choice. And so if you just look at their observed or their revealed preferences in the standard sense, you may be missing a lot about how that institutional arrangement affects their well-being, but you just can't observe it. And the second is behaviors that are driven by imposed norms, addiction, or self-control problems. Smokers, for example, are less happy than non-smokers. Obese people are less happy than non-obese people. That really defies the standard consumption choice framework where a revealed consumption choice is what you use as a measure of utility. But real people don't always behave the way neoclassical economists think they do. And this approach is a good way to get around questions where you can't observe a choice or where choices are sort of perverse or they're actually not good for people's welfare, but they do these things anyway. Very quickly, just on terminology. So happiness is the concept that's used more broadly. From a research perspective, and we all used happiness in well-being surveys when we started because that's all there was and that's all we knew. But from a research perspective, happiness isn't a great term because it could be happy yesterday, which is sort of contentment. It could be happy with your life in general. But that same, you get confused if you're just looking at a question about happiness. It does attract a lot of public attention. It's in the title of all my books for that reason. And then, the first thing I have is a disclaimer how we need to use these other terms. But it's in the Declaration of Independence. But really now we've gotten to a point where we've identified 3 distinct dimensions of well-being and measure them separately. One is hedonic well-being, how people experience their daily lives, their mood, positive or negative, smiling or worried, as they do different things like commuting, spending time with friends, or working. So I think of hedonic well-being as the Benthamite kind of well-being, which is the most contentment for the most number of people. Then there's what we call evaluative well-being, which is how people evaluate their lives as a whole. And it turns out that this correlates more closely with income than hedonic well-being, because after a certain point, more income won't make your mood better. If you're destitute, it's terrible for all dimensions of well-being, but after a certain income point, which varies depending on the context, more money won't make you smile more, it won't make you enjoy your friends more, it won't make you enjoy your commute more. Even if you're in a fancy car, if you're in traffic for 2.5 hours, you don't care about your car. All you want to do is get out of it, right? So money and hedonic well-being are not very closely correlated. Money and life satisfaction and other evaluative well-being measures is more closely correlated. And that does not mean that more and more money makes you more and more happy or satisfied with your life. But it does show that people who have means are much more able to make choices and live the kind of lives they want to lead. So if you answer this kind of question and you're young, you think about the opportunities you have in the future, and if you have an ability to achieve those opportunities, you're going to score higher. And if you're older, you may look back on your life as a whole, your kids, your professional accomplishments, whatever it might be. Again, if you have more means, you will score higher on that question. It doesn't mean that more and more money will make you more and more satisfied with your life. And then eudaimonic metrics measure life purpose and fulfillment explicitly, and I will leave that dimension to Carol Riff for tomorrow because I'll save some time. And she knows more about it than I do. Although we've begun to work with it from a data perspective. So probably at 4:30 on a Thursday, nobody wants to see equations, but bear with me for a minute. It's important that just to talk about how we measure this. So we use these econometric equations. We have large N data. So for example, the Gallup data, which we work closely with, has 1,000 Americans, or 500 to 1,000 Americans a day from 2008 through 2018. So that's large N. Very detailed questions about well-being and health and other things. And then the Gallup World Poll, which we also use, interviews 1,000 to 3,000 respondents per country per year from 2005 until now, and that covers 162 countries around the world. So it's, again, a huge number of observations, which is very useful because you get the kind of law of large numbers, and you can, of course, there's some bias as individuals answer these questions on any given day, but we're pretty good at controlling for those, and the large numbers help us a lot. So in terms of the equation, you have well-being of individual I at time t. So, and that well-being, that W, could be life satisfaction, it could be stress yesterday, it could be happy yesterday, it could be anger, it could be a whole range of things, and you'll see some of our results. X is a vector of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, and then the unobserved traits are in that epsilon or error term. Standard econometric equations typically just toss out the epsilon as error, but because so much of well-being is innately determined, there's information in that epsilon, which is the things we can't observe about individual well-being. And in 2004, I was crazy enough to write a paper where we actually isolated each individual's what we called unexplained happiness in the residual that was in that error term, and used it in a second stage equation to see if it led to anything like more income, more health, better social life. And we got a big yes. We also got laughed at, and everybody thought the paper was garbage, and now it's my most cited paper. So things have changed a little bit, but the point is that there is a lot we can't observe that's innately determined. We're getting better at teasing that out, but it's this intersect between your environment and your innate well-being that sort of turn into outcomes that we care about. And what we find is remarkably consistent patterns in the determinants of life satisfaction around the world. I did the first, until like 2002, something like that, most of the studies on well-being were in developed countries. And everybody assumed that poorer countries and poor people in poorer countries would be different, that money would matter more because they're poor. Well, it turns out the balance between income and these other factors that determine well-being is remarkably similar across countries, across people, across time, all over the world. So money matters, as I mentioned. It's not the only thing. Age is quite an interesting thing. I'll get to that in the next slide. Health typically comes in terms of relative magnitudes, more important than income. It doesn't surprise you. If you're sick, you can't enjoy whatever you might get from income. It takes away your agency, lots of things. Employment, everywhere we study well-being, we find that the unemployed are significantly less happy than the employed. And a newer study we've done, if I have time I'll get to it, is out of the labor force, prime age people out of the labor force, which is a big problem in the U.S. now. So even though we have booming stock markets and presumably record lows in unemployment, we have 20% of prime age males out of the labor force. They just fall out of the denominator of the equation, of the ratio, because if you haven't looked for a job in the past 6 months, you no longer fall into it. So our 4% unemployment rate that everybody boasts about is masking 20% of prime age males out of the labor force, and those also linked to the deaths of despair. Social relationships matter, and marriage always comes out positive in these equations. And this is a funny way to talk about marriage, but it's actually an artifact of construction in the data. So I know, sounds a little weird, but bear with me for a minute. When you have cross-section data, right, you're just looking at a big sample of people across at one point in time, and you're comparing married and non-married people, it turns out happier people are more likely to marry each other, and less happy people are less likely to get married. So what you're actually doing is picking up their initial levels of happiness of the married people compared to the non-married people. So when you hear some of the conservative media about, marriage makes you happier and everybody should be married, it's just wrong. There's some overtime data that shows, so where we've been able to follow people over time, and that shows that the positive kind of happiness boost or well-being boost you get from being married lasts about 18 months. And then people just revert back to their already higher levels of happiness, the married people, but there isn't sort of a long-term boost, at least in reported well-being, of being married. And a dear friend, colleague of mine in France, Claudia Senek, wrote a paper called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife." And it shows that basically the probability of divorce is highest when you have asymmetries in happiness levels in the couple. So it's better to have two happy people being married or two unhappy people being married, but you don't want a happy person and an unhappy person because they drive each other crazy. So anyway, once we can control for these things, we can then explore the well-being effects of things that vary or change more, such as inflation, unemployment rates, inequality, environmental quality, personal behaviors such as smoking, exercising, commuting time, and more. The most important thing to remember from this slide is that we are not asking people, does smoking make you unhappy, or does marriage make you happy? People don't know that we are matching their traits with the well-being questions we're answering. So age, and then I'll turn to the kind of inequality of well-being story. This is a pattern that holds almost consistently in almost every country of the world. So we found in the Gallup World Poll that it held in 142 of 162 countries. It will make you happy or unhappy depending where you are in the curve. So this happens to be Latin America data, but it's very consistent. The low point in happiness or well-being is in the middle-age years, ranging from, say, age 40 in some of the happiest countries where people get out of the curve earlier to as late as 55, 60 in very unhappy places like Russia, where it's terrible to age and well-being there are low levels of well-being anyway. One could argue that that's also life expectancy for males, so maybe the women get happier when the men die off in Russia. I don't know. But in any event, this is a really consistent curve. There are lots of ways to explain it. One very obvious one is it's just the middle-aged years where there's often a double burden of, say, children and elderly parents. There are a lot of time burdens, financial burdens. There's also an aspirations aligning with reality effect, you hope. So by the time you're 40, which can be kind of disappointing, right? But if you hope by the time you're 44 or 45, if you can't play guitar and you can't sing, you probably should give up trying to be a rock star. So that can be an unhappy time for people. But it's, you know, it's very clearly concentrated in these years. Psychologists talk about what happens here as increasing emotional wisdom as people age. So older people have more stable emotions, younger people have more emotional swings. In economic terms, having had 3 teenagers in the house at once, I describe it as the standard deviation of bad experiences is much higher for younger people. So a bad experience is the end of the world. By the time you get up, you know, out of that you've had so many bad experiences, they roll off your back. Just 2 more quick points. This isn't just about well-being data. The stress displays a inverse U-shaped curve in about the same age range in almost all the same countries. And then there's my colleague Andrew Oswald in England did a study of cheerfulness in apes. I kid you not. He published it in Science, so I think it's pretty good. But in any event, they found that apes have this, their smiling goes down in their middle age years, whatever the middle age years of apes is, I don't remember. So there's something biological going on too. Okay, so to the point of the rest of the talk, what's quite sad is that a large number of people in this country are not coming out of the U at all. The deaths are concentrated between age 34 and about age 60, roughly, and due to suicide, opioids, alcohol poisoning, preventable deaths. Again, driven by less than college educated middle-aged whites. So the U curve has lots of reach. Okay, so very quickly, one of the things that I found over time is that individuals who have more positive attitudes about their future mobility, about their future, they have higher levels of well-being and vice versa. So there's kind of 2-way causality. But because of that, they're much more willing to invest in their future, and they usually have more capacity to do so, right? If you have opportunities, you have more opportunity to invest in your future, usually. And then they do better, right? They earn more money, they live longer, they're healthier, they have more friends. Individuals with more limited future opportunities and lower levels of well-being have higher discount rates in the sense that they value the present more than the future because they don't believe in their future, and they typically have less capacity to invest in their future. So I think a lot, going back to this idea of the high cost of being poor in a rich land, one of the things about the U.S., being poor in the U.S., is that you actually do need more material things to just make it. You often need a car. You need health insurance because we don't have national health insurance. Like a lot of very poor countries have national health insurance. It may not be great, but you can go to the doctor if you're sick. Jobs are so unstable now that there's this kind of vicious cycle where if you think about a single mother with kids in daycare and one of the kids gets sick and has to stay home, mother can't go to work at the crappy job at McDonald's. After 3-4 days, loses the job. Absolutely not, nothing to fall back on, and you get vicious circles. The same thing can be with a car breaking down or whatever it might be. So the poor live with a lot of stress and what we call bad stress, which is due to circumstances beyond your control. So we've looked at the effects of stress on well-being and find that income and education, not surprisingly, mediate the negative effects of stress. Because it's one thing to have stress associated with goal achievement, and you can have horrible days and all sorts of things, but at some level it's much more in your control than these kind of constant negative shocks that you have no control over, that the poor tend to face. So that kind of stress is actually much worse for well-being. So keep going here. So now to the U.S. So one of the things, it's no longer surprising, but when I got into this, it was more surprising. Now we seem to be so aware of how divided we are as a country. as late, this whole idea of the U.S. belief in the American dream, that we're exceptional, the Horatio Alger Society, it persisted well beyond the point where not only did our inequality increase, but our mobility levels decreased. So as late as 2001, some colleagues of mine, Alberto Alesina and co-authors, did a study of the effects of inequality on happiness, comparing the US and Europe, and they found that the only group, so in Europe they found that inequality had a modest negative effect on well-being and that it was strongest for the poor. Very intuitive. You're at the bottom of the income ladder, inequality should bother you more. In the US, the only group that was made unhappy by inequality were left-leaning rich people. Northeast liberals and some in California, I guess. I don't know. They didn't have locational data, but So by 2016, a Pew survey found that 62% of Americans think their children will be worse off than they are. 62%. It's, it's not replicating that study, but it's suggestive of a very different beliefs trend, and I'll show you more about that in a bit. Versus, and that compares to some countries in the OECD, Spain and Portugal, in fact, where Sergio's from, but well below the Scandinavian countries, Britain, France, Germany. In contrast, in Latin America, only 13% of Chileans, for example, think their children will be worse off than they are. So if we're the land of opportunity, people don't seem to believe it anymore, and it turns out we really aren't the land of opportunity for everyone anyway. And then this is more of a picture of our divisions done by David Leonhardt, New York Times economics writer, and his colleagues based on Google words. And they looked at there are common words everywhere, like Oprah Winfrey or football, but the words that were common in difficult places to live and the words that were common in wealthy places to live, and they're very different words. So the words that were common in poor America were guns, religion, hell, antichrist, stress, obesity, diabetes, video games, and fad diets. Not a pretty picture of life, but one thing that stands out is it's living at the moment. There's no future in any of those words except for hell and antichrist, which doesn't sound too good. And patched together solutions. Common words in rich America are iPads, baby joggers, baby Bjorns, cameras, film rollers, and exotic travel destinations like Machu Picchu. So investing in your knowledge, investing in your health, investing in your children's knowledge, broadening your horizons. Could be two different countries, and as we know, they are. So what did we do research-wise? We have this Gallup data, both US and World Poll, and I started with comparing well-being metrics and attitudes about the future in the US and Latin America. Latin America, a region long known for high levels of poverty and inequality. Other things are getting much better. And also similar cultures, similar market-oriented economies. And then within the US, we looked at trends in well-being and ill-being across socioeconomic cohorts and races and places. And our more recent work has been matching the well-being data with the CDC data on premature mortality. So I'll try and get through all this. So first of all, this was all in 2014, 2015, where academics were talking about our divisions, but nobody else seemed to be. And this is experienced stress yesterday. These are income quintiles, which correspond roughly, poor corresponds roughly to the US poverty line, and rich corresponds to over $120,000 a year, and the middle is the middle. And then the question is, did you experience stress frequently, yes or no? And as you can see, people in the US experience much more stress on a daily basis than do people in Latin America. But the more important thing in this slide is the gaps. So the gaps in experienced stress between rich and poor in the US are almost twice as big as in Latin America, and US poor experience much more stress than any other of these groups. And it's this bad kind of stress. This is smiling yesterday, which is a measure of positive affect, positive mood. I sort of like this slide because I'm from Latin America and there's great quality of life and a lot of cheerfulness. So Latin Americans smile more on a daily basis than Americans. But again, the story here is in those gaps. Again, the gaps between the rich and the poor in the U.S. are twice as big as the gaps in Latin America. So again, our poor are not just more stressed, but they're the least likely to smile than any other group in the comparison. And remember, this is poor people in Latin America. They're materially much worse off than poor people in the U.S. And this is the question, or the result that made me think I should write this book, and that's belief in hard work. The question's very simple. If an individual in this country works hard, he or she can get ahead. Yes or no? It's not framed. It's a good question. It's pretty hard to mess up your answer. You either do believe it or you don't believe it. And again, we find huge gaps between the rich and the poor in this question. The gap between the U.S. rich and poor is 20 times greater than the gap between the poor and rich in Latin America. And indeed, the gap between the poor and rich in Latin America isn't even statistically significant. So our poor don't believe in the American dream anymore. The rich seem to. There's something called learner's just beliefs hypothesis, which is if you get ahead, you want to believe that the society you got ahead in is just. And probably lots of these respondents worked really hard to get ahead, but they probably also had some advantages, right? But they're very different beliefs in the American dream. So once I got this finding, I thought, I wonder how it differs by race in the US. So this was about 2015, and it was the time of the Baltimore riots and the Ferguson riots, and a lot of concern about the African American community. And so I thought, I'm going to compare, these are the biggest demographic groups in our data. I mean, we have Asian and others, but these are the sort of the biggest three groups. So I compared poor blacks, poor Hispanics, and poor whites. And going into it, I thought I would get a negative coefficient. We had an optimism question, not a hard work question, but roughly similar. But I thought I'd get a negative coefficient on poor blacks, a kind of nothing on poor whites, and a positive coefficient for poor Hispanics, because Hispanics are very cheerful. They always score above their weight in terms of well-being measures compared to their income. And what I got was, I'm sparing you how we did this. So what I got, first was this finding where poor blacks were 3 times as likely to be higher up in the optimism scale than poor whites, which is the left out group, and poor Hispanics about 1.25 times. So this is right before I started working with Sergio, and I was coding this data myself, and I thought I'd done it wrong, right? So I redid it, kept getting this, and then just to confirm, poor blacks are half as likely to report stress the previous day than poor whites, and Hispanics maybe 2/3 as likely as poor whites. So there's something more to this. Now, neither poor Hispanics or poor blacks objectively experience less stress, so they're more resilient, right? That's part of the story. And shortly after, now these findings are controlling for religion, for, well, the groups are defined by income, but for education, employment status, reporting pain the previous day, which is gateway into opioids. I'll go back just for a minute. Bear with me on this slide so I remember. So basically, we're controlling for all kinds of things, from age, rural, urban, BMI, gender, education, employment, pain, as I mentioned, reporting health problems, marital status, religion, because blacks are also the most religious group in the US, but this is not religion driving that finding, and destitution, lack of money for food or health care. And then we used a whole range of well-being and ill-being metrics, reported life satisfaction, expected life satisfaction in 5 years, which is optimism, stress, worry, satisfied with your city, and do you have social support you can rely on in times of need. And then in additional specifications, we added in this CDC measure for the preventable deaths at the county level. So it's to include suicide, liver disease, accidental poisoning, and indeterminate deaths, among others. And we first did it at the MSA level, and this is joint work with Sergio, now published in the Journal of Population Economics. And we also then did it at the county level, and the results are essentially the same. So if you take, if you just looking at this, and when I got these results, these were before the deaths of despair data came out, so they seemed even more puzzling. But then Ann Case and Angus Deaton published their studies showing our mortality rate going up due to preventable deaths among less than college-educated whites. And I went, oh, bingo. So I wrote Angus and said, our data on well-being and ill-being are telling the same story as your mortality data. So we decided to match it. Would they actually robustly match? And so first of all, this is just to give you a picture of this mortality trend. So the headline are U.S. whites. And these are all middle-aged years. The mortality rate for ages 45 to 54. So those are U.S. whites. The thick blue line there is U.S. Hispanics. So Hispanics are not displaying the same trend. I'll come back. I don't have to. Sorry. So Hispanics don't display the same trends, neither do blacks. They're almost not in the deaths of despair. There's some few pockets of both, but very little, nothing. And then as you can see, all the other OECD country comparatives have steady declines in mortality, which is what you'd expect for rich countries at this point. So what did we get when we did these matches? We got, at the individual level, the composite death rate for 35 to 64-year-olds is negatively correlated with life satisfaction and optimism, and positively correlated with stress and worry. We aren't making claims about causality because we can't. We don't have overtime data, but I think it goes both ways. So if you are in this cohort of declining white, blue-collar class, living in hollowed-out places where there's a lot of opioids, a lot of desperation, that may make you more likely to be on opioids or commit suicide. Those are the patterns we find anyway. And at the individual level, the distribution of desperation and these behaviors is concentrated in these places. So it's hard to say which way the causality runs, but I think it's a two-way thing. And then we also looked at the level of place, sort of average level trends across U.S. MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas. And we found that we were looking at sort of what could we find about place, but also health behaviors and how they vary by place. And so this kind of goes to the question of infrastructure. It's not built infrastructure, although if you think about the hollowed out places in the heartland, there's also distance and climate and low population density. So unlike cities where everybody walks and interacts, and in these places everybody drives, it's really hot or really cold, there isn't sort of a vibrant little town center where people are running around or going jogging together. I mean, so the isolation and the infrastructural factors in these places, I think, contributes to the problem. But so you get the percent of smokers per MSA is negatively correlated with life satisfaction, positively correlated with stress, and the percent of respondents who exercise is positively correlated with current and future life satisfaction, and negatively correlated with stress. And as an openly addicted runner, I like that finding. But and then we find that racial diversity as a characteristic of place also matters. So the share of blacks is positively correlated with future life satisfaction and optimism, and negatively correlated with stress. And we were essentially aggregating up our data to the level of place, but there's also locational patterns in terms of place. So the places that are more diverse, have better health behaviors, are more economically vibrant, much lower mortality rates. They're typically in the coast of the country or big cities, Chicago, big cities in Texas, whatever, so, there's some vibrant places in the middle, but there's, the coast stands out. Now, if you were to overlay a map on these trends, you can look at a map of premature mortality, you can look at a map of reported pain, which is a gateway into opioids. So we find, for example, that reported pain is highest among poor rural whites than any other group. You can look at a map of reliance on disability insurance. You can look at a map of anger, stress, and optimism. And you can look at a map of Trump voting. And the sort of similarities in these maps are very striking. So one of the things we tried to imperfectly do is to isolate just the role of place. And I'll talk you through this, so don't worry about how small they are. So what we did here is we said, okay, controlling for everything else. So the employment rates, the education rates in these places, health behaviors, education, religious preferences, all sorts of things. What is left over that just place explains? So these are maps of optimism. The top is for whites, the bottom is for minorities. And just quickly, because I know I need to wrap up. If you look at the dark green are the most optimistic places. If you look at the lower mortality map, what you see is that the most optimistic places for mortality for minorities are the southern, southeastern cluster of states, so Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and then the southwestern states where Hispanics are concentrated. But so what's going on with the southeastern states? They're racist, they have terrible indicators, long reach of discrimination affecting mobility rates and other things, and yet there's a concentration of black culture and churches and food and music that seems to have an additional effect, right? Remember, this is controlling for a lot of the bad things. The same goes with Hispanic culture in the Southwest. And as you can see, whites are optimistic in quite different places. The gray areas are places where we just don't have enough observations for minorities, overwhelmingly white, like Maine and New Hampshire. So we don't perfectly understand place. It's something I want to know more about. And there's some, I'm not an infrastructure expert, but there's obviously some definition of infrastructure that helps explain this, and I think it shows up in the Happier Cities things and some of the other work you've heard about. So the last thing, and then I'll stop, is kind of where do you go from here? And I'm really trying to understand differential resilience levels, and I've had a huge, almost a second education from talking to sociologists and other people from other disciplines that understand or have looked at historical levels of African American resilience, and I think Hispanic resilience fits a lot of the patterns of resilience of migrants, and kind of the role of race and place. So we have, first of all, some new work on historical data in the panel study of income dynamics, where we found that respondents who were born from 1935 to 1945 and report to be optimistic in their 20s are more likely to be alive in 2015. The other thing we find is that African Americans and women increased their optimism levels in the 70s when gender rights and civil rights improved. Guess which group started its decline in optimism? Less than college-educated white men. And that corresponds with the decline in manufacturing, almost exactly. The point is, if we'd been tracking well-being over time, maybe not as early as, the 1970s, but over the past 10 years, like the Brits do, we wouldn't have been me and my Brookings office on my own going, what is going on with poor whites, right? Before we got the full-blown opioid crisis and everything else, with lots of other determinants. But if the metrics match so well, you could have said, why are people so desperate and angry and in some of these places, and why is it so concentrated among less than college-educated whites? It also shows that optimists live longer. Higher levels of well-being are pretty much a good thing. And then we have a study on hope and differential levels of resilience among poor Peruvian adolescents, 18 to 19 years old. So they've all finished high school. Not one of their parents has gone to college. And we asked them about their aspiration educations, among other things, and we find that 85% of these kids say they're going to college or postgraduate. And if you ask them if they can achieve that, 95% of the 85% say they can. Now, they actually can. So Peru has decent public education. It's not great. And if you're poor, you make sacrifices because you're not earning money if you're in college. But people believe in education still, and parents really sacrifice to help their kids reach it. We also looked at the question whether optimists mispredict or not. So are these just Pollyannas saying they're going to get all this education and it'll never happen? And we find, looking at their past predictions and how much education they achieved, they're pretty on the mark. Nobody's perfect predicting their future. We also found, speaking to resilience, that almost every one of our high aspiration kids had had a negative shock in the past. So they'd been robbed or a victim of crime, or a parent had left the household, or they had a sick household member, and they still were very determined to succeed. If they were sick themselves, that was the one negative shock that wasn't associated with higher aspirations, and that makes sense, right? They've lost their agency. In some other work, Sergio and I looked at the Gallup panel data for 2014, and we find that optimists in period one don't perfectly predict their future optimism, but they're pretty close. They're still optimistic 4 years later. And we've poked into that data in 2017 after the election to make sure this wasn't just an Obama effect, and we still find that the optimism gap between poor blacks and poor whites remains very high. There was no fundamental shift with the election. And also these optimists tend to, remember, they're not wealthy, but they did better than the non-optimists. So there's a resilience story here that I want to understand better. And one of the things I'm going to do going forward, if I ever get the funding I'm waiting for, is to repeat this in Missouri, the Peru survey in Missouri, because I do a lot of work with Wash U and St. Louis, and you have this microcosm of Americans' problems. So you have poor blacks in St. Louis City, destitute, hollowed out, whatever, poor whites across the river, former coal mining towns, and so forth. Lots of opioids, lots of suicides among poor whites. Interesting, the first stab at this showed that poor blacks in St. Louis City are not only more optimistic than the poor whites across the river, they're more optimistic than respondents in St. Louis County across the Del Mar Divide, which is very wealthy, very white. So there's something deep about this. Interestingly enough, I've also been doing a lot of kind of more qualitative interviews with people like the head of historically black colleges and other places, and blacks and Hispanics still, first of all, they still believe in the American dream much more than poor whites, but they also believe in education. And one of the things that seems to have come with the decline of manufacturing and living worse than your parents, for big groups that never went to college, has come with it a real sort of a lack of trust, or lack of trust in education, lack of trust in elites. And so my guess is the education aspirations of poor blacks will probably be higher than those of poor whites, even though objectively and materially they really live much worse. Okay, so let me just wrap up. There's nothing remarkable about my conclusions except just a couple of things. This decline of the blue-collar working class or low-skilled worker, the fate of low-skilled workers, is not unique to the U.S. We see it in Europe. We see the rise of right-wing populists in Europe. There's structural trends that really drive this. It's not migrants and minorities. It's some, maybe a little bit, maybe some Chinese trade in the U.S. manufacturing story, but it's really jobless, tech-driven growth, right? So there are less good low-skilled jobs, and there's more competition for them. There's some positive stories about comeback towns in the heartland that I won't get into now because I think I'm over time, but there's some opportunities for low-skilled workers in the low-skilled tech sector, outsourcing to poorer U.S. places. But ultimately, this is kind of tectonic shifts in the nature of work going forward that we have to deal with. In the U.S., I think it's exacerbated by exceptionally high inequality, by not very good public education systems, and largely by the American dream itself. This belief, if you work hard, you get ahead. If you fall behind, you're a loser, right? And the dream, blue-collar whites had privileged access to that dream. You got the jobs your fathers had. You had a stable, sort of middle-class life. But what came with that was respect, right? You had a decent job. There was the Ozzie and Harriet family. It was, that was the structure of white working class life, and it's fallen apart. Not just the jobs, but with the jobs went marriages, lots of other things. And when a big manufacturing firm pulls out of one of these places, a lot goes with it. So you also just have decreasing population density and other things. There are other things so this kind of, and the whole stigmatizing of welfare was, welfare was for migrants and minorities. So there's still, in the same group that's so desperate, there's this anti-government, anti-welfare sentiment But collective support can be a good thing. It's held a lot of these communities together. There are other things we really don't understand, such as differential resilience across races. I mean, that's a very stark story, but I can't say I can explain it. I can identify it. And then the big question, of course, is, we have some evidence that hope and resilience really lasts, even with negative shocks. I want to know more about that. But also, can resilience be learned or restored in places where hope has been lost? There's some pretty neat experiments from people just working in the field that suggest that particularly young people who grow up in bad circumstances can be taught tools to increase resilience, but it's a very open question. There are also lessons from the well-being research that show that in these deprived places where people are isolated, like prime-age males out of the labor force, are disproportionately, not just on opioids, but sitting at home playing video games all day. That's a toxic combination. But the well-being literature based a lot on the British work, a group called What Works Well-Being that I'm an advisor to and work with, where they implement interventions in deprived communities that are not very expensive, but they then assess their effects on well-being, but also other things like health behaviors from a cost-benefit perspective, and then a generalizability or scaling perspective. And they're very simple things like improving access to the arts or access for volunteering in these places where you have a lot of people who aren't going to work again, like most 55-year-old former coal miners or former car manufacturing workers, that show that just providing opportunities to get people out of isolation and to, have more of a collective sense of existence seems to really improve well-being. Younger generations just need to be they need better education, not necessarily college, but you can't assume a whole generation of low-skilled young people is going to be fine if they don't find employment. So there are some positive examples and strategies we can look at. And finally, as I mentioned before, if we'd simply been tracking well-being regularly here, we might have been a few steps ahead of where we are now in finding this pretty daunting social crisis, which is spilling over into our politics and all kinds of other things. So I hope I went on a bit long, but thank you.
Time for questions. Thank you so much. Very nice research. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably everybody's exhausted. Oh, maybe not.
We have questions.
Thank you for this, which is so relevant in this day and age that we are living. One thing, actually two questions. Have any of these liberal, democratic, hopeful candidates come to you, or some of these messages being shared with them, or them being educated about this, more scientific look at what's going on? And secondly, on this differential resilience, and I don't know even how to pose the question. I had to deal in a personal situation with a number of Black Americans, and it was a case of discrimination in the law. And me being here in this country for the past 30, 40 years, I wasn't born here, I was outraged. Whereas when I was interacting with the Black Americans, they were accepting, sort of. And I hate to use the word acceptance, but it felt to me like years of exploitation or discrimination against them had raised their tolerance level, so to speak, to observing an unjust situation. And I don't know whether that historical, if that's a factor at all, or if it's just, something that is totally irrelevant. But anyhow, thank you so much.
Very good questions. No candidates have approached me, which doesn't surprise me, but certainly I've been involved at the state level and at some city levels where governments have implemented well-being indices. City of Santa Monica advised. Vermont has a big sort of happiness measurement effort. Maryland for a while had something called the GPI, which was a general progress indicator based on well-being metrics. I don't know if it still exists. There are others, Seattle, I think it's Seattle and Portland have also kind of explored in this area. There's a lot more in the space of kind of quality of life, quality of work, in the thinking about the future of work, that it's going to look different, that also sort of takes from this literature. But it probably better off that it doesn't get into the political sphere. I remember with our National Academy of Sciences panel, it was written up in the Wall Street Journal before we'd even met as an Obama government effort to have the government tell you how to be happy. So we weren't funded by the Obama government, we were funded by the National Academies, and obviously this work is not telling people about how to be happy. But so anyway, to that question. And then resilience, yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how good our definitions of resilience are. My experience is that, yes, some of this story is about having to deal with discrimination and injustice over time and building psychological adaptation mechanisms to get beyond it. Some of it's about expectations. So if you know the system's unfair, you know everything you get is you work for it because it's not helping you. The rest isn't helping you. So I think that's where the American dream sort of is biting the people who had privileged access to it before. Now it's kind of coming back at them because they're realizing the system isn't always fair and that it's jaded and favors wealthy people and whatever it might be, and they have no other narrative, versus both migrants and African Americans have had to deal with discrimination. They've internalized the fact that the system isn't always fair and it often works against them, and so you still want to go to school, you still want to get ahead, and you have a story of gradual, hard-fought progress that's a healthier story. So just a very quick anecdote on this that's, I think, really compelling, and it's not based on large N data, but a colleague, friend of mine, Andrew Cherlin at Hopkins, has done a lot of work on whether you believe you live worse or better than your parents, and most minorities and African Americans say they live better than their parents, and a lot of blue-collar whites say they live worse than their parents, which reflects the reality, but believing that you live worse than your parents is associated with less trust in others, less trust in government, lower levels of well-being. And he's done some new work in the Bethlehem Steel, former Bethlehem Steel neighborhoods, Dundalk, Baltimore, for starters. And you had, a very vibrant steelworking operation going on, and the whites, blue-collar whites, had privileged access to the good jobs. And in the 50s, a cohort of African Americans from North Carolina was brought in to work in the steel mills. They lived in segregated housing. They kept switching the rules on them. Even when you had civil rights laws passed, they would change the definition of seniority and everything else, so they never got the same kinds of promotions. So Andrew's been interviewing the kids of the former steelworkers. So the kids of the white steelworkers still live in Dundalk. They haven't gone to college. They're upset. I'm not saying they're raging Trump supporters, but they're basically, pretty jaded about the system. And they're really upset that there's Section 8 housing and Hispanics in the neighborhood. Versus the children of the black steelworkers, almost all of them, went to college. They live in nice parts of Baltimore like Towson. They come back to the church in the neighborhood, which is the same neighborhood The Wired was shot in, and they come back every Sunday and give back to the community. So that story says a lot about, resilience in terms of getting ahead. Even though your parents were discriminated against, they pushed you to go to college. It says a lot about the community ties, though, that also seem to drive that. And I think you could probably blow that study up in some way and explain a lot of these differences. Not all of it, but.
Yes.
Yes, and to add on to that, I was thinking Arlie Hochschild wrote a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, and she interviewed Tea Party supporters in Louisiana, and she found some of those dynamics that you're asking about among whites there. They basically feel like they're overrun by the government and they're not getting the things that they're promised. But my question to you was, I've been doing work on young adult well-being, and I'm interested in your findings among poor blacks and poor whites. Do they differ by age? I know you talked a lot about the middle-aged deaths, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question. And back to Arlie Hochschild, what's amazing about that book is she finds that, so these whites in Baton Rouge most of them have had really bad negative shocks to their lives because of industry, polluting the Gulf, firing people who, you know, all sorts of things, and yet they still believe more in the industry than the government. And she's trying to build empathy, and she talks about how generous these people are, and they all, you know, offer her tea and whatever, even though she's this liberal Berkeley professor. But at the end, she's saying goodbye to one of the people that kind of hosted her, really introduced her to everybody else, who had been fired by BP, I think, or Shell, I don't remember which, and his, you know, half his family had died from cancer from the pollution. And she just can't figure out why he's so, you know, kind of almost passive about it, and still doesn't believe in the government, still supports the Tea Party, still supports industry. And when he says goodbye to her, she says something about, you know, she hopes his brother's okay or something else. Well, you know, I don't know, but otherwise it'll be better in the next life. And she just kind of, you know, it's hard to get your head around that. I mean, even whatever you believe in, it's just sort of the kind of this convoluted belief structure that, you know, there isn't really a positive narrative to get out of it. And then in terms of, this is a cool finding with most, if you look at optimism curves, life satisfaction has that U curve, and people get happier with their life, or have higher levels of life satisfaction as they age. But for most people, optimism tends to drop a bit as they age, because particularly if you're asking about the future. Well, you know, if you're 75, you may think things are okay now, but you're probably not optimistic about 5 or 10 years from now. Some are, but the average trend is a slight downward trend in optimism when you have an upward trend in life satisfaction. The only group where optimism stays at its high levels into the older years are African Americans. Younger African Americans are also more optimistic, but they're more frustrated and angry. And then older African Americans are just more optimistic, and they sort of much less angry with age. So anyway, yeah, it's a story of resilience and more that we don't fully understand.
Questions? Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham.
Thank
it was
you
a
for
pleasure to
having me.
have you, and we appreciate your being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
So I know some of you will stay here until guided elsewhere, and then for the rest of you, we hope you will come back tomorrow morning, and we will resume this amazing wonderful set of speakers who have really enlightened us and given us so much to think about and reflect on in relation to this whole concept of infrastructure and happiness. And I would like to thank all the speakers today for their marvelous presentations. It was fabulous to hear what you are all doing. And we look forward to tomorrow's conference as well, and we hope that you will come back. Thank you.